The quickest way to lose a story in the middle of a crisis is to not tell one at all. That's a quote from crisis communication expert Molly McPherson in response to the royal family's recent blunder over the Princess of Wales' health. Now, I recognize it's highly unlikely anyone in our audience manages PR for the royal family. The fact of the matter is, we all face crisis, both in our personal and professional lives. An essential tool that we have at our disposal is our communication skills. Hello and welcome to PowerSpeaking Live. I'm Carrie Beckstrom, the host of this monthly series and the CEO of PowerSpeaking Incorporated. Following today's event, this episode and all past ones can be found on the PowerSpeaking podcast. Today, we're going to be exploring the vital role communication plays in responding to crisis, helping people to adapt to disruptive change, and helping them thrive through the challenges. Now, often when we think of crisis communication, we associate it with the corporate communication and PR teams. The fact of the matter is, it's the role of all leaders at all levels to effectively navigate a crisis. And this point was really underscored during the pandemic. I'm sure you can all recall this. And it really put a spotlight on what it takes to effectively communicate during a time of extreme crisis, such as the importance of communicating simply, clearly, and often, and choosing candor over charisma. These are just a few of the skills and strategies that we're going to be exploring with our two expert panelists joining us today. I am delighted and honored to introduce to you Stacy Slaughter. Stacy has a wealth of communication and branding executive experience, both in the political realm and professional supports industry. Stacy, among other things, spent the past 3 decades in the professional supports industry as a communication strategic and crisis management executive vice president for the San Francisco Giants. And if I recall correctly, Stacy, I believe you retired from this role in December?
Yes, that's correct.
Yet, you're still actively contributing your expertise now as board member and strategic advisor to the newest National Women's Soccer League franchise. Welcome, Stacy.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Also joining us is Kurt Kellogg. Kurt is a strategic communication professional with over 18 years of experience creating communication strategies for U.S. military CEO equivalents and many other leaders. Kurt's most recent role was Director of Communications at U.S. Special Operations Command, where he oversaw communication efforts for the nation's Special Operations Forces enterprise and its nearly 80,000 military and civilian personnel. And Kurt is in the process of transitioning from a rich career in the military to one that I'm sure is going to be equally rich in the civilian world. Welcome, Kurt. I'm so thrilled to have you with us.
Great to be here. And just for those that don't know, Carrie's been a mentor to me as I'm doing this transition piece. So she's been a wealth of knowledge for me as I make that transition. Thank you.
Thank you both. All right. Something I think would be interesting to start with, given that your collective experience spans a variety of fields, is in your experience, what's different between crisis communication in corporate, political, military, professional sports, and also what common principles apply across these diverse industries? How about if we start with you, Stacy?
Great. Thank you so much. Look, I think there's probably more that's similar than different. If you think about these industries, they're all highly public industries. Generally you have a beat of reporters who cover you on a daily or weekly basis. And so I would say there's probably more similarities. Obviously, when you're dealing with military, you're dealing with highly sensitive, intelligence, and there are life and death situations in that, which I think is obviously much more extreme in terms of your strategic communications. I think from a similarities perspective, like I said, you generally have a beat of writers who cover you, so you can establish relationships. You have, audiences that you're communicating with, both internal, your personnel, plus the external audiences. It could be the community at large. It could be baseball fans, in my case, customers. So you need to really drill down on who your audiences are and make sure that you have messaging that's tailored specific to them. And then that's kind of the third thing, is this common set of strategic messaging. And whenever you're dealing with a crisis or an issue, you want to make sure that you're all on the same page and speaking with one voice, and then having a kind of a global set of messagings that can be specifically tailored to your audience.
One of the things, Stacy, you brought up is it's interesting because whether it's a crisis or any other kind of communication, you talked about some tenets that are so important. One being understanding the multiple stakeholders that you have, and the combination of having these overarching themes or points that you want to make sure you consistently communicate across your stakeholder groups, but also being really effective at tailoring them to each different audience. And that's where I think those line managers are so essential, because they know their teams best and often are the most trusted because the teams are closest to them. So in a bit, we'll be talking about specific strategies and advice for leaders. And I just hoping we can get Kurt into this conversation. I think it would be absolutely fascinating to be at a cocktail party with both of you. I can only imagine the number of colorful stories that you have in your arsenal. We don't have time to hear them all, but Stacy, would you share with us one of your most memorable crisis communication challenges and how you worked through that?
We talked a little bit in thinking about this panel about kind of good crises and bad crises. I think Kurt and I have probably seen our fair share of bad crises. I was with the Giants during the whole steroid scandal that rocked Major League Baseball. I've dealt with executives being incapacitated and unable to perform their duties. I've dealt with, layoffs and things like that. But I also deal with a lot of good crises, one of which was when the Giants went to the World Series 3 years, every other year for 3 years straight. It's a similar dynamic where you have this crush of media, these crush of fans, customers, the community at large that wants a piece of the team in a very, on a large scale. The team had never gone to the world, had never won a World Series since it's, 50 years in the Bay Area. And so there was this, influx of fans and media that wanted to cover it. Plus, we had to plan a World Series parade for 1 million people in a matter of 3 or 4 days. Similar principles applied. We had to credential 1,000 media, and and a lot of it was about over communicating to the media about what our plans were for the World Series parade. Where media could cover the World Series, where fans could watch the World Series parade, what are the messages, who's going to be there, on a very large scale. And, in that case, it was a very joyful time, but the stress level was no different than if you were dealing with a major incident of an accident at the ballpark or a crisis in that way. Again, it was about tailoring the message so everyone was hearing the same message at the same time. It was looking at different ways that we could communicate with the fans. Fortunately, we had social media, so we could instantly get out messages to media via Twitter and other ways, and email, and really making sure that our executive team at the top, from the CEO on down, was fully aligned and on the same page messaging wise, so that all of our fans and the media and the elected officials and the public at large were getting the same message about, what our plans were, because we were shutting down the city basically for a whole day. And literally we had 1 million people show up for this parade. I mean, they were waiting for 50 years for it to happen. And it was, and then and once we did it the first time, I'm like, you know what? It would be great to try to do that again. You never guarantee that you're going to win a World Series. And then 2 years later, we won the World Series and we got to build on that. And then 2 years after that, we won the World Series again and got to build on that again. So we were very fortunate in that regard. But it was a tremendous amount of work. I think it took probably 2 months off my life.
Oh, gosh. Well, some things you mentioned, Stacey, I love that you pointed out the fact that crisis isn't always a negative thing. It can be a very, very positive thing, like winning the World Series. The key, though, is you've got expectations so high. So effectively managing that to meet those expectations and not unintentionally turn something that's so positive and so celebratory to something that could be disappointing to fans. So the stakes are still so incredibly high.
And so much of it is about communication and being very open with your customers or your employees, from very much to, were the employees going to be allowed to walk in the parade with their families? That's an audience. The people who service the ushers and the ticket takers and the concessionaires, what was their role in the parade? It wasn't just about the players. It was about the whole organization, because everyone plays. And we wanted to make sure that everyone felt a part of the celebration, because they all play an important role. And so the internal, in many regards, sometimes gets overlooked. But it's just as equally important as the external piece of it, not just your customers, but your internal, and that's the same, unfortunately, we had to do layoffs during COVID. And I think one of the lessons that I learned from that, we had never done layoffs in my time at the Giants, was really treating your employees like adults and helping to manage their expectations and being very honest. Don't overpromise, but also give them the information that you have at the time so they can plan, for their family and things like that. And I think that's one of the things that companies and organizations tend to make the mistake, is they try to kind of go into a bunker and they don't, obviously you can't share everything, and there's, personnel, HR issues involved, but the more that you can treat your employees like adults, the more that they appreciate the way things are handled. And oftentimes that doesn't happen.
100%. And I love that you pointed out the celebration of winning the World Series. The goal was to not just recognize the players, but to recognize all those other people behind the scenes that had a role in that. That's wonderful. It reminds me, with the pandemic, how we've finally recognized the importance of recognizing those frontline workers.
Right, exactly.
Kurt, are we able to hear you?
Can you?
Yes.
It's a long-time listener, first-time caller. Holy moly.
You can share with us.
Oh, yeah. Where are we at in the movie? What's the question?
What we're talking about is, if you could share with us one of the many memorable crisis challenges that you've had to deal with, and just some examples of how you navigated it successfly.
But I've dealt with a lot of crisis that involve, obviously, military operations. One of the things we war game quite frequently is obviously the unfortunate loss of soldiers and airmen, sailors, and Marines, and that happens in combat. But it takes a different turn when you do it in peacetime. It's not expected, and when it happens in such a public manner. When I was in Hawaii in 2017. I had literally been on the island about 6 weeks, was just starting to navigate the different players and stakeholders there on the island. And we unfortunately had a helicopter crash overnight in the ocean, which added its own dynamic to it. And the thing that was most important for me and for, I think, for everybody involved was teamwork. We had so many stakeholders instantaneously that needed information. And quite honestly, we didn't know a lot. And it was kind of a divide and conquer approach to it. You know, there was the public piece of this because we had the Coast Guard, the state of Hawaii involved in the search and rescue here. It's not Afghanistan or Iraq where it's just us. It's every government agency, state, local, and federal was involved in the search for this particular helicopter and our crew members. Just so there was a public piece to that with the news and everything else. But there was also instantaneously all the different stakeholders that you can imagine, the family members, the employees, if you will, the soldiers in that unit and across the wider Army, elected leaders. There was just so many different and all at the same time wanting to know what's happening. And there's certain levels of information that you can give others that you can't give some, mainly because it gets into speculation and this and that and something else. But it took a concerted team effort across those different agencies and with leadership to do that. And understanding your best communicator is your CEO or your commander or what have you. But when you have competing stakeholders simultaneously, which one's the most important for him or her to engage? And in a situation like that, I would say the most important constituency or stakeholders are the family members, right? Or your employees. That's where leadership needs to be. And I could handle the news media. And then at times that'll flip-flop depending on the situation and who the different stakeholders are involved. But it was a 4 or 5 day ordeal just from a search and rescue standpoint before we got into the next phase of that. So it was constant communication. I think we were communicating with families every 6 hours on, to include midnight, 6 a.m., noon, 6 p.m. We were doing that constantly, and I was engaging press constantly as that was all going on. Not only that, but coordinating with these different agencies who are supporting you. You always see those press conferences where the chief of police or somebody is the person at the podium and they've got the array of agencies behind them represented. That was my moment to have that. And I don't say that as I was looking for that. It's just, I remember looking at the tape going, there's the fire department guy, there's the ocean search and rescue guy, there's the Coast Guard guy, and they're all there to support me and get the same message out and cross-level that information. So yeah, it's, but I've seen that a lot in government. And it was heartening as difficult as it was when that happened.
Yes. Yeah. Wow. Way to bring home the point of teamwork. And just like Stacy was talking about, being conscious of the various different stakeholders and the roles that each of you play in frequent and consistent communication. Kurt, I want to build on something you brought up because I know this is something that a lot of leaders struggle with. We talk so often about traits that are critical to being an effective leader is being authentic and transparent. So in a time of crisis, how do you balance transparency with the reality that sometimes there's confidential information that cannot be communicated, in some cases for legal reasons? So any advice on striking that balance?
Back to the teamwork piece. As a professional communicator, and Stacy knows this, we're a subject matter expert on about that much. I used to say I'm about an inch deep and 10 miles wide because I need a legal expert. I need the operational expert. Whatever the crisis is, there's someone that actually owns that issue from they're about, an inch wide and 10 miles deep. And it's a matter of bringing those folks together and figuring out what the common operating picture is or common picture is, to include the legal folks, to include the folks who understand what the liability and what the second and third order effects are of what you're dealing with. Or maybe you don't even know what that is. But until you lay that flat with the team, you're not sure what you can communicate and what you can't. And the other thing you have to, once you know that, particularly the legal side and the communication side, and Stacy knows this, oftentimes there's legal reasons, or in the military, national security and operational reasons from a classification standpoint. You just can't give certain details. because it would compromise intellectual property in the civilian world, for example. It would put you in a liability standpoint, either financially or as far as being at fault. But at the same point in time, you've got to balance that with a need and in the many cases in the public sector, the right to know. And so it's a balancing act. And I won't say one side wins or doesn't. It's a matter of trying to get it right. And at times, the legal side has to win as much as you might want to say something so you can get your story out as clearly as possible. But you've got to take into account the legal things. But at the same point in time, there's a risk reward with that. You can lose or win the battle, but lose the war reputationally or something else if all you are completely concerned about is the short-term legal liability. You may cause long-term irreparable harm from a reputational damage standpoint. So where's the balance? And there's no right answer to that. You got to figure it out as you go, and it's not easy. It definitely takes a professional team to have good, honest exchanges as you do it. And leave your ego and your feelings at the door as you try to do what's best for the organization.
Great advice. Stacey, I'm interested in what you have to share, because this reminds me of the example you were just talking about where you had to do layoffs and treating people with respect and, being as upfront as you possibly can so it doesn't come as this completely out of left field.
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly what Kurt said is spot on. It's a balancing act. The only thing I would add to that is sometimes acknowledging that you can't share everything. There's a reason I can't, I can only, this is under investigation, or, we've had players who have been, suspended for steroids, or they're under investigation, acknowledging to the media or the employees, like, at this point, I can share with you what I know. And I know there was a message in the chat that asked about what happens when you're communicating every 6 hours, but you don't have any new information. Obviously, that's not ideal, but the fact that you're acknowledging the stakeholders, or in this case, probably the families, as Kurt was dealing with, the fact that you're hearing them and you're visible to them, I think is also just as important as being present is very important. You may not have the updated information that you hope to have, but at least continuing to acknowledge their presence and letting them know. But I do think it's important to always acknowledge to the employees or whoever your audience is, look, at this point, I can share with you X, at this point, or I'm not at liberty to expand on this for, security issues or, pending investigation or things like that. I think acknowledging is super important. It doesn't solve the matter, but I do think you're hearing, you're previewing to the press or to the audience that you know what questions they want answered, and you just might not be able to share that information or as specific as they want. And then the only thing I would also add, which is Kurt alluded to as well, is having the experts up there as much as you can is more credible than having what I like to call the talking heads. And that would be me, that would be Kurt, and I think that's very important. Like if there's a legal issue, having the general counsel speak, or if there's a financial issue or a player injury, having the team doctor or whatever, it's really important to have the experts there, and prep them. Like my job is to make sure that they're fully prepared to answer any question that's going to come up, but it's more credible for the organization to hear exactly from the expert in the field as opposed to the press spokesperson. And I always say that a really good press person is an invisible press person, that you are prepping your CEO or your general manager or whoever it is, your mayor, and they're going out there and really answering the tough questions because it's good for the organization to hear directly from those folks.
Excellent. Talking about the importance of communicating, even if you're unable to share details or don't have new information, reminds me of the quote I shared at the very beginning, that the quickest way to lose a story in the middle of a crisis is to tell no story at all. And I just think of the family members. If there's an absence of any communication, you just go to the darkest place, even if that might be the outcome. But just
someone else comes in and fills the void.
Exactly.
Someone will take control of your message if you're not. I call it feeding the beast, explaining the method to your madness, whatever it is. Like don't let someone else take control of your message, and with social media and we have ways of communicating, not to say you bypass the press, you always work in collaboration with the press, but you also have other ways to communicate with your customers or your employees via social media, email, whatever, and take that opportunity to do so.
Excellent. Thank you for that question, David. Let's talk about proactive crisis communication. I would imagine there's a whole lot that needs to happen up front to have a comprehensive crisis communication plan so that when a crisis ensues, you're prepared to respond swiftly. Let's see. Stacy, could you talk a little bit about key components of an effective crisis communication plan?
Yeah, I mean, you can't anticipate every crisis that's going to happen, but you can put a framework in place that really enable like a, kind of a chain of command. What is if there were a, major crisis at the ballpark, who's going to run point on the operation. And we do a lot of drills and crisis. It's not just the communication. We do a lot of crisis planning, and Kurt is probably way more experienced in this than I am, given his roles. But it's very similar. You're anticipating who are the audiences we need to worry about. What is the type of messaging? What are the vehicles for delivering those messages? Who are your spokespersons? All of those things. And you can kind of create a framework for a crisis management plan. And then whatever the crisis is, then you can plug it in and then, be ready to respond. So I think having a framework is really important. And we do run these tabletop exercises quite a bit, both in San Francisco is very prepared because of earthquakes and all those things. And then we also run a lot of tabletop exercises at the ballpark for a number of, situations, both citywide and just within the ballpark to be prepared.
Excellent. So that comprehensive framework and then practice applying them. Kurt, anything to add?
Say, she's spot on. And if you look at most industries, they could probably brainstorm, 80 to 90% of the things that can happen to them. Not the specific details necessarily, but, at this day and age, there ought to be a cybersecurity or a cyber hack, plan. There should be, I hate to say it, but an active shooter plan. There should be all these types of things that are industry specific and just workplace specific that you can do for your organization to have a framework in place. And it's not just the communicator. It's who else needs to know within the organization, what external agencies need to know. If you can exercise all that, even better, because Eisenhower said, plans are nothing, planning is everything. But you have to exercise the plan because you'll find out where it falls apart. But the framework gives you something to work with. You find out where the friction points are. You find out where you have white space, and you get the best ideas to come through that friction and say, and it's not necessarily the communicator. And it may not be the operations guy or gal that owns that particular issue in and of itself. Someone looking at it from the outside and go, did you ever think about that? If you can do that before the crisis hits when you're planning for it, you're better off having to deal with that in the midst of that crisis, because you're going to have that happen anyway. The more of those seams you can close up before it ever happens, the better. But you have to exercise that. And you particularly need to do that for your leadership as well. How do you get someone that's calm during a crisis? Test them. You got to test them. To him or her, they've got to play along as part of that training environment. It can't just be, you all take care of that, because just like Stacy said, it's the leader, it's the subject matter expert that's going to be the credible voice, and they need to have practiced their role as much as possible when these things actually happen. Because if they haven't done that, they're about to go through a crucible, and they're not prepared.
So, Kurt, that gets on the question I was just going to ask next, and just anything that you can expand. Going back to leaders and teams' roles in time of crisis, can you elaborate, aside from putting them to the test, how you train leaders and teams to respond to crisis swiftly and decisively while maintaining composure?
You have to, and they've got to be able to take feedback. The other thing is go through it, but then be able to take some critical feedback, because you don't know what you look like in a crisis. You don't know what you look like in an event until maybe your peers or your subordinates come back to you and say, you did this well, but you look shaky here. Or if you can get even some external feedback that's not even part of your organization, particularly if they're not part of your hierarchy, they can give you some real honest feedback. I used to tell junior leaders who would get nervous in a situation, not even a crisis, but just I would say, you're the sun in your orbit and you're going to spin. And just like our solar system, the planets that are further away from the sun but are in your orbit, they're going to spin faster, which means there's more chaos, more speed, more everything. And the further out in your organization that they are, but they have some action they have to perform, if you're chaos personified and you can't learn to be at least controlled and calm on the outside and be deliberate with your actions, even though you need to move with a purpose, there's a difference between moving with a purpose and moving just fast to move fast. You need to move with a purpose. Another old saying is, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And it's about being deliberate with what you're trying to do as opposed to just taking action to take action. So, but you've got to practice that, and they've got to take the critique and then try to apply that. That's the only way I know how to really do it. Maybe take up some Zen and some yoga as well. Some meditation always helps with some calmness.
Can I add one thing I want to add is, and I think this becomes kind of, and it's exactly what Kurt's saying, but to put a finer point on it, is your North Star is your goal. Like, what are you trying to achieve with this comms plan? If it's, there's been an earthquake in San Francisco and we had 40,000 fans in the building, obviously this, safe evacuation of folks and making sure, there's that. But then also kind of what is the goal at the beginning of a crisis plan? What are you trying to communicate? Obviously you want to come off as credible. You want to come off as you have control in the situation, that you're calm, but you're also trying to communicate a message of, that the building is safe, or there's, whatever it is, just to make sure that you always have kind of in the back of your mind, what is the goal you're trying to communicate? Otherwise, like Kurt says, you could be spinning your wheels and not saying a lot of things. And message discipline is what really helps that. But at the end of the day, you're really trying to, communicate a goal so that, you somehow exude calm and confidence amongst your employees and your customers or whatever external audiences you're trying to communicate with.
Great advice. So having that line of sight to that North Star, real clarity on the objective. And then to your point, Curtis, ensuring that you provide lots of practice and that all individuals involved have to be open to feedback and a willingness and ability to continue to refine their approach. Can you get personal for a minute in terms of what strategies personally work for you, aside from just having vast amount of experience in this? For instance, Stacy, you said that preparing for the World Series celebration took 2 months off of your life. What are strategies that help you sustain your ability to remain calm and in control?
I think Kurt talked about this. The teamwork aspect is really important. And to back up just a little bit, I think having leaders, if it's your CEO or your commanding officer, whoever it is, really understand and appreciate the importance of the communications role in this aspect. Sometimes the lawyers have a tendency to get and I'm married to one, they get way ahead and they're like, you can't say anything. And it's like, okay, there's a lot of different competing, strategies that we need, goals that we need to. So I think having a team and built around trust that is established long before there's ever a crisis, so having good working relationships, not just with your CEO or whoever, but with all of your colleagues who are really providing the framework to manage through the day-to-day grind of its, organization, or to manage through the day-to-day grind of a crisis. So I think that's really important, and having folks within that you can bounce ideas off of and who have expertise in their customer or their employees and say, hey, is this going to fly? Is this not going to fly? So I think for me that, and then obviously having a sense of humor and being able to just realize, and in Kurt's case, it's a lot different because they are dealing with lives. In my case, we're not dealing with brain surgery and lives. I mean, sometimes it is, but I think that's really the trust and support of my colleagues has always been really helpful.
Wonderful. And that was echoed by one of our audience members. David said, it seems that trust plays a critical role in all of this, without a doubt. Anything you'd add, Kurt?
Little wins as you go along, as you're establishing your relationship. A lot of the times we come to these jobs and say you're working for the CEO. They may have hired you, but you haven't been through anything together. And I don't mean a crisis, but just anything. Building those little wins as you go is critical. It was critical for me when I worked for the Chief of Staff of the Army. We had a great non-crisis oriented relationship until COVID hit. And then things took off. But I had built enough capital in the trust bank that he trusted me when things got really tight and things got really, strange for that year, as we tried to navigate the Pentagon and the nation and support them with whatever was going on. Matter of fact, I remember being one of the very few people still going into the Pentagon as we were trying to go out and do those things. But I was one of the few people he wanted with him all the time. And it was just because of the relationship we had built. And he trusted me. I certainly trusted him. But without that, you've got nothing. That's the basis of everything.
Wonderful. Little wins. I'd like to go back to the leader's role. What are some of the most common mistakes that you've seen leaders make in the time of crisis that are things we should watch to avoid?
The bunker mentality is, not to use a military term, but I will. I've had experiences with leaders when the going gets tough and they just put their head in the sand and don't want to talk to the media. They don't want to talk to the fans because they're being criticized. They're, too thin-skinned about something. And my whole thing has been, I've always preached about explain the method to your madness. Like, be out there, be proactive. And to something Kurt said about little wins, one of the ways that you can have these little wins, so when you do have a crisis, is build that credibility with your audiences well ahead of any crisis, so establish that trust so that people give you the benefit of the doubt when something does go wrong, that the organization is seen as an organization with good intent that always tries to do the right thing. That doesn't mean they always get it right, but at least they're trying and they really have the interest of the organization at heart. And I sometimes think when leaders have a tendency to kind of go underground when there's a bad situation. We had a situation where a player was accused of sexual assault. It was a very murky situation. And, I got a call at midnight and I wanted to, and the reporter was going to break the story. And I was like, give us 5 hours to understand what's going on here. And we'll sit down and we'll work with you on the story. Just to make sure that the first thing, and it turned out it was a false accusation and it all ended up being fine. I mean, it wasn't an ideal situation, but having that credibility and not completely just going underground, I think helped us navigate that type of situation. So that would be, and then also bringing your not because I have a personal interest in this, but bringing your comms person in at the beginning, understanding what are all the pitfalls, what is what's your exposure here, and having that person joined at the hip with the CEO and if there's a lawyer or whoever's involved to make sure that they're in at the beginning so they can anticipate how the public or how your customers or how your employees are going to react to whatever situation is going to happen.
And I would imagine because you've already established such strong credibility with the press, that bought you that 5 hours that you...
It did. Yeah. And that is built on 20 years of, okay, I know you're not going to screw me over on this story. Let's figure out what's going on here. Let's have full information. And that's a big part of it, is also making sure that you have full information before you're, going out there as much as you can.
Right. Okay. So avoid the bunker mentality. Certainly that's something you want to avoid. Anything you want to add, Kurt?
Just say I would go back to building that relationship, just like Stacy did with the press and just like I did with the press and the other stakeholders. A lot of times, in good times, the leader will want to engage employees. They'll want to engage stakeholders that might be able to affect their bottom line with budget or with shareholders. a lot of times they still don't want to interact with the press. I can't stress enough, they've got to build a relationship with the press as well. Stacy and I carry a lot of credibility with those folks working with them day in, day out. And if we have to engage on their behalf, that works for a very short period of time. But when the big event happens or the uncertain event happens, doesn't even have to be a full-fledged crisis, the lack of leader presence, the lack of a message from that person is in and of itself a message.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the wrong one. And so it doesn't matter whether they have to engage employees in the middle of a crisis or the press. If they don't make their presence known, that's a message. It's not one they're looking to send. So they have to understand that messages, not just a bunker mentality, but just this willingness to not engage and not build relationships.
We have a great question here. Lonnie Smith, do you have comments about crisis management in multi-generational workforce that include boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, etc.?
Well, I think you have different vehicles for communicating with the various generations, and we certainly have that at the Giants. You know, we had every different generation. I also think there's, you know, the younger generations has a much higher expectation of what information they should be able to be told. And so managing that, and I think part of that is acknowledging, I think there is an expectation that they need to be heard probably more than maybe my generation did. And so acknowledging that and figuring out the best way to pay service to that is super important, because again, you know, they're going to fill the vacuum. They're going to make assumptions if they're not hearing directly from the leaders of the organization and in a way that they feel, you know, it may be that you can't communicate full information for whatever reason, but I think acknowledging and letting them, you know, giving them the information they can when you can expect it, but you should also expect there be higher demands from the younger generations on what needs to be communicated. That's not a very articulate way of saying it, but it's,
That's
challenging.
Absolutely. And finding a way for them to have a voice.
Yeah.
Your point. Yeah. David Bender brings up a point I know you're going to agree with vehemently. Leaders can ramble when they're communicating, especially if they're nervous or unsettled. Learning to be concise, clear, and confident is ultra important. And that comes back to the practice, willingness to take feedback and really commit to getting better, especially in high-stakes situations. I would like to talk a little. Oh gosh, we are so nearing time. All right, so let's take one more in terms of focusing forward, looking ahead. What emerging trends or technologies do you believe will significantly impact the field of crisis communication in the coming years? I can suspect what you might want to speak on.
Would say artificial intelligence, deepfake technology. The fact that that stuff is being proliferated in particularly the social media space, misinformation and disinformation. And in many instances, you think you want to get ahead of something, but you're already behind. And trying to validate what you're seeing in many instances is just very, very tough. So that's going to continue to be the challenge, I think, for organizations and communicators is how do you cut through the chaff and how do you counter some of that? How do you get ahead of it, particularly with the speed? It was fast before, it's even faster now, particularly when you're reacting to something that may not be true, but you can't verify it without doing some very, very deep analysis on the video or the audio. And even that, some of that stuff is so good that you can't really tell, other than that you talk to the people involved and they're like, there's no way I was there. There's no way I had that phone call. I never had that conversation. But getting to that before it's proliferated across the mediums is going to be the challenge, and then fighting that back down. That's my primary one, that when I think about what concerns me as someone that has to react to it, those in particular.
And having to be so much more judicious in getting to what's the truth. Anything to add, Stacy?
No, I think it's exactly spot on. I think that's a big risk, and it has such far-reaching implications for society and the world. And and at the same time, I think some of the technology, I mentioned this earlier around social media and being able to get your rapid response messages out more quickly than back in my day in the mayor's office, we would fax out press releases to the global fax machine, and it would take 2 hours. So that being able to communicate directly with your stakeholders and then also utilizing social media for good can be really helpful. And so, and I do think there is a role potentially for AI, not in the way that Kurt was talking, but about being able to do our jobs more effectively and more efficiently, and verifying information or drafting press releases or whatever. I think that's I know some people who do that. I haven't yet, but I do think there's some good that can come of that. But I think you have to do it very cautiously, and but the risk of imitation or forgery or things like that just makes me really nervous to move in this political climate.
Absolutely. You're obviously not alone. Well, let's try to end on a more a positive note. If you could leave your audience with one final piece of advice, something that's within their control, within their power as it relates to effectively dealing with crisis, regardless of the role, regardless of the field that individuals are in, what would that advice be?
Well, at the Giants, I was kind of famous for a few little Staceyisms, and they're not new, but I talked a little bit about explaining the method to your madness, and keep it simple. The one that I would leave you with is really two. One is rip the Band-Aid. It's not going to get easier as you let these things fester out in the world. If it's a perception of an organization, like, rip the Band-Aid off. Tell people what's going on as much as you can and try to move through the crises. Don't try to hide from it like a bunker. So that's one. And then the last thing is, look, this all boils down to respect and trust. If you respect your stakeholders, if you respect the audiences and you treat them like adults and you acknowledge when you can't provide the information you can, but promise to do so as quickly as you can, I think goes a long way in establishing this trust and relationship that you need to have with media, employees, external factors.
Excellent. Those Staceyisms are very wise. Kurt?
Transparency and honesty, first and foremost. You have to tell people what you know, when you know it, that you can within the limits that you have to work with, as often as you can. And sometimes it's not very much, and it'll grow as you go. But that has to happen. And the best spokesperson for your organization is you, the CEO, the leader, whoever owns that particular problem. Do it in conjunction with someone like Stacey and myself in the legal department and everything else. Don't just hop on the PowerSpeaking live webcast and webinar to spout knowledge.
And go rogue.
Or go rogue or get a headset that works. But do that. And finally, I would tell people to really think about what a crisis is to you. There's existential crisis. Is my organization going to survive this? There's change management, which is a crisis to your employees. That's why there's a lot of similarity between crisis communications and change communication. But what's really a crisis, and there's, I guess, what's important is where you sit. So you're going to have to measure that, and you're going to have to work with that. But understand that some crises, you come through, smelling like roses, and sometimes you just come through. Everyone's not going to be, we just won, the most, wonderful thing ever. Sometimes it's, we survived that. It just depends on the nature of the crisis. But as long as you're there the next day to fight again and to keep doing what you're doing as a business or an organization, then you weathered the storm.
Excellent words of advice to close with. Thank you both so very much. And a special thanks to our producer for helping us resolve the audio issues, so we were able to hear from both of you. This has just been extremely useful. I want to thank you. And for our audience, thank you for your engagement. I'll close by giving you a preview of the topic we're going to be covering next month, which is all about mastering the art of the Q&A.